Welcome to the Mortarboard, the administrator's source for solutions in higher education. We tell you about challenges other schools have faced, benchmark the problem, share their best practices and epic fails, and invite you to consider whether what worked for them might also work at your institution. Hosted by longtime college president Dr. Dan Barwick, this is the Mortarboard, the source for solutions in higher education.
If the content of this podcast interests you, then you'll enjoy my new book, Risk and Reward: How Small Colleges Get Better Against the Odds. It's now available from Amazon in ebook, paperback, and audiobook format. The best way to find it is to head over to my blog, mortarboardblog.com, and click on the link on the front page. If you have any thoughts about the book, don't hesitate to send me an email and let me know what you think. My guest today is Dr. Yolanda Watson Spiva, whose 25-year career in post-secondary education spans a range of executive leadership, general management, federal government, public affairs operations, and academic officer positions. She's currently the president of Complete College America, a national leader in the movement to increase the percentage of individuals earning a post-secondary credential. Dr. Spiva is the former president and CEO of College Success Foundation, a national nonprofit college readiness, access, success, and scholarship organization in Bellevue, Washington. Prior to that, she served as CEO and executive director of Project Grad Atlanta, a nonprofit based in Georgia. She has also held a number of positions within the U.S. Department of Education, including Region 4 Public Affairs Director in the Southeast Regional Office of the Secretary of Education. In addition to having authored numerous research articles, Dr. Spiva also co-authored the NAACP Image Award-nominated book, Daring to Educate: The Legacy of the Early Spelman College Presidents. She has been awarded the prestigious Turknett Leadership Character Award for outstanding leadership in the nonprofit sector. She earned her undergraduate degree in economics from Spelman College, her master's degree in public policy from the University of Chicago, and her PhD in higher education from Georgia State University. Yolanda Spiva, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Dan.
Can you tell us a little bit about the history and the mission of Complete College America?
Yes, Complete College America was founded in 2009 by Stan Jones, who had served in the Indiana state legislature, as well as served as the commissioner for higher education for the state. So having had a political background and understanding the politics of higher education, but also being very committed to the ways in which higher education could transform itself if folks committed to looking at data in order to think about why completion rates weren't at the place where we would like them to be as a nation. And so Stan is what we would like to call an impatient reformer. And he really had this vision and a mission around creating an organization that would take the best of politics, public policy, and working with campuses in order to reform policies and drive change at the system level. So thinking about states and systems of higher education and the ways in which they work together in order to drive change on college campuses around completion. And so for the past 11 years, 12 years, we've been working at it in terms of creating the vision, expanding the vision that Stan created. He had a vision of creating an alliance of states, and we are now at the level where we have 48 states, systems, and consortia of institutions who are a part of the CCA Alliance. And this year, we just had our most recent sign on to the CCA Alliance, which was by the state of South Carolina. So welcome to the state of South Carolina. And we're continuing to do the work that Stan seeded so many years ago around being bold national advocates who are focused squarely on making sure that colleges and universities are places where completion is the end goal for students, and they're not there to get some college and no degree, and that they complete on time.
And how long have you been with the organization?
I've been with CCA for 3 years. Actually, this month is my 3-year anniversary. So 3 years with CCA, and it's been the best time of my life, really moving the agenda forward and working with wonderful folks who have campus experiences. Pretty much all of the outward-facing staff have had previous campus experience, which makes a difference, and also folks who have policy experience. So we are excited to work across the various legislatures and with the governor's offices, as well as institutions across the nation to really continue to ramp up this work.
Well, I know that our audience heard in the introduction that you have a very comprehensive resume, so we're delighted you're here. Now, you've called the current way the U.S. measures college completion as a bait and switch. What's the problem as you see it?
Well, I think, essentially we cast the conversation about college with high school students and others as being a 4-year time frame. So for a 4-year degree, we say it should take 4 years. And for a 2-year degree, it should take 2 years. But we know that, unfortunately, most of the students in a 4-year situation are actually completing at 5, 6, sometimes 9 years time. And so the 150% 150% time horizon is actually something that most students don't understand. That's the language we use as administrators. And we've actually kind of made that acceptable. So I think the bait and switch is that, what students would expect is that if they're going to a place that takes 4 years, like elementary school, if elementary school is K through 6, it wouldn't be acceptable for a 6th grader to still be in 6th grade 4 years later, right? And so if it takes 6 years to complete K through 6, or if it takes 4 years to complete college, you would expect that the system would structure itself such that a student could actually navigate that system within the guidelines. And I think the bait and switch is that what students actually find is that they're kind of on their own when they get there, and they're having to navigate the systems and structures and figure out how they're going to complete on time, or even surmount hurdles that may be put into place intentionally or unintentionally that actually don't facilitate college completion. They actually serve as impediments to completion.
Well, I'd like to just make clear for any members of our audience who don't know this, and particularly our international listeners, approximately what percentage of college students actually complete college in 4 years?
Well, that statistic varies because it's definitely less than 50%, unfortunately. And if you disaggregate it by the subpopulations of students, that varies again by race, by income, and by ethnicity. So I think what we're seeing in terms of students completing an on-time completion, it is not where we would like it to be. I think for our nation, we would like it to be, a goal would be probably higher than 75%. We're nowhere near that. And even in terms of right now, the goals around having, a 60% completion rate by those who are 25 years and older within our country, we're certainly not near that, unfortunately, although we're trending toward it. So I think the data continue to show us that a greater majority are actually completing beyond the 4-year time horizon.
Now, I know that you might not have exact figures in front of you, and that's fine. I'm curious, in your experience, though, what pops? You mentioned subpopulations. What sorts of subsets of students are very likely to finish college within 4 years, and what populations are much less likely?
Well, unfortunately, those students who are the first in their families to attend college, we call them first-generation college students. Those students are less likely to complete college in 4 years, and that's typically because of the fact that, they don't necessarily, quote, know how to go, right? So understanding how to navigate the college enterprise is something that's difficult for them. So that's the first group or subgroup. The other group would be those who have been historically marginalized from the college enterprise. And so racialized minorities, which includes, Black, Indigenous, or Native American students, in particular, Southeast Asian students, not all Asian students, but Southeast Asian students, and then also Latino, Latina, Latinx students, so those who come from those backgrounds. They tend to not necessarily complete on the 4-year time horizon or a 2-year at a 2-year college.
And I'm going to guess the students at the opposite end of the socioeconomic spectrum are the ones who are most likely to finish?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And so essentially what we're seeing is that the students who are wealthier, students who have parents or siblings that have gone to college before, so they kind of have a roadmap, they are more likely to complete college at a faster clip. Even if it's not at 4 years, they're certainly going to complete college sooner than their lower income or lower resourced counterparts. And then certainly those who are white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant tend to be those students who will complete on time or complete closer to on time. But right now, I mean, the national 6-year completion rate, back in 2014, I guess it would be the last sort of indicator, it was about 60% of our students writ large who completed at a 6-year completion rate. And again, that's for all students. It doesn't even disaggregate them by subpopulation. So as you can see, we have a long way to go.
You've pointed out that many who work at colleges see education as something that ought to be, and in most cases will be, finished in 4 years. They actually see it as that students will actually finish in the 4 years. Is it possible that even people who work for colleges don't fully understand just how dismal the completion rates are?
Yeah, I think that, well, one, there's a lot of times there is the sort of, I don't want to say navel gazing, but, an obsession with one's own institution, right? So they may be steeped in their own data, but sometimes they're not, right? I think, unfortunately, when the news isn't the best, that's not necessarily what folks want to talk about. And so I think interrogating the data is important, and that's whether it's good news, bad news, or if it's, a plateau information, it's important to disaggregate and interrogate the data so that you understand where you're doing well and you want to do more of that, whatever you're doing well, and then where you're doing poorly and you want to do less of that. So I think that, yes, many of the folks who work on college campuses are well-intended. I do believe, that these folks are very altruistic in nature and they want the best for their students. But I also sometimes believe that they get caught up in how it's always been done, right? So a lot of times there are longstanding policies on campuses, but also practices that are just the way things have always been done. And folks aren't necessarily going back to Stan Jones and being an impatient reformer. They're not impatient about reforming the system, whereby they say, why are we placing a financial hold on a student and they can't get their transcript and now they can't enroll? Like, does that make any sense? And what do we need to do to get rid of that policy or that practice? Because sometimes a lot of the practices are not even codified in policy. They're just the way it's always been done. So I would say I give a lot of credit to those folks on campus and want to believe they're well-intentioned. But I think that a lot of times, one, not being clear about what their graduation rate is, and if they are, not understanding how their graduation rate compares to their peers across the state or across the nation, especially within whatever sector they're in. So if they're a private 4-year, understanding what that looks like across other private 4 years or even across other sectors. So being able to have those data, and that's what Complete College America attempts to do, is to level the playing field by sharing data that tells institutions and states about how well they're doing or how poorly they're doing, and hopefully to give them tools that they can use in order to improve their graduation rate and close attainment gaps between those different groups we talked about by race, income, and socioeconomic level.
You raise an interesting detail there about the kinds of things that can interfere with the students' progress, and that's obtaining transcripts. I've worked at schools that have a essentially ironclad policy, like an absolutely zero exception policy, where if a student has a debt, it could be $12. That student's transcript cannot be released. And yes, which means that the student is essentially just stuck wherever they are. And I think to myself, my God, this $12 is standing between this person and continuing their education. It's really remarkable how sometimes the school's policies so clearly put I hate to say the welfare of the school, because the school isn't going to live and die over $12.
No.
But they clearly put the welfare of the school above the students' welfare.
And that's what I was about to say. It would make sense if these holds and these fees that they're charging folks, if they were a cash cow, right? So if we could show that, an institution made $1 million a year based on fees, most of these fees are non-recoverable, right? They're going to have to write them off to bad debt. So, this doesn't even make any sense. It doesn't provide any appreciable gain to the institution. And so it's just a matter of habit and what we've always done. And to some extent, it's almost like I want to stick it to the student for having, you lost your key and we charged you a $25 fee with interest and with other fees added. And now it's metastasized into a $15,000 charge. And we think we're going to recover those dollars. You're not going to recover them. It doesn't make sense. Free the student, liberate the student so that they can enroll in, whether it's in your institution or another institution, liberate them to pursue their dreams of higher education.
And the really amazing part about that, not to just gripe about that practice, but you're right, schools do eventually write that off, but the time frame, that they wait until they write it off is always long enough so that no matter what, they've completely devastated the student's chances of moving on. That is, they're going to eventually write it off anyway, but they have a policy, okay, for accounting purposes, we write that off after 5 years. Mm-hmm. Well, a student who is forced to stay out of college for 5 years is statistically, very unlikely to rejoin higher education. And so it's a sad situation.
Well, at CCA, we have a saying about trying to make institutions more student ready, as opposed to the total emphasis on students being college ready. So essentially, the language has been about students need to prepare for college and they need to be ready for college. So we're trying to teach them how to, present themselves in a way that they are worthy to be within the higher educational milieu, as opposed to saying, wait a minute, how do we now look at colleges and repurpose and restructure them in a way that allows them to meet a student where they are? And so I think if those folks who are working with students had a more student-centric perspective, which means you put yourself in the student's shoes and think, does this $12 fee make sense? And does it make sense, as you mentioned in your example, to basically prohibit a student from re-enrolling for 5 years over this fee? The answer would be no. And I think we should borrow some of the philosophy, like at the Marriott Hotel, the Marriott franchise. They have a saying that anyone in their chain of command can, quote unquote, make it right. And so if you have some displeasure and you voice it to a staff member, whether it's the person cleaning your room, the person at the front desk, or someone in corporate, all of them are empowered and enabled to make it right. And I love that, because what it says is, first of all, they believe and they stand behind their mission and their brand, and they want to make sure that they create a repeat customer in you. So when I think about higher education, if we would borrow some of those sorts of values and practices and ways of being, I think it would make a difference in terms of, one, having repeat business. If a student wanted to come back for another degree or credential, if their family member wanted to come to that institution. But a lot of times we tarnish our reputations with our students or former students, where they have no a desire to, one, return to the institution. And of course, if they complete, they have no desire to give back as an alum. So I think we need to think about that on the front end and do a better job of sort of keeping the customer service element of this in place and keeping the students at the center of the enterprise.
Well, it's funny. The audience, of course, can't see that I'm smiling, although maybe they can hear it. But you're actually first of all, you're the second guest actually to compare higher ed unfavorably to Marriott. And the second thing is, when you say, that the people there are empowered to make it right, I smiled to myself because I thought, I'm absolutely positive I've never worked at a higher education institution in which, say, a person on the phone at student accounts is empowered to make a decision. That's right. About the fate of a student's account. Mm-hmm. And it would be interesting to see what would happen if that change were made. I asked you before about what percentage of students finished in 4 years. And you thought, well, it was definitely less. It's less than 50%. If that's the case, if less than half of students finish within 4 years, and a widely accepted statistic that I've also seen is that less than 2/3 finish within 6 years, is it safe to say that most incoming students are inadequately informed about what college is likely to cost them? We estimate for students what the total cost of their education is likely to be. And we're definitely not estimating it, for that 25% who aren't even going to finish 6 years from the time they enroll.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, like I said, I know it's definitely less than 50% that complete in 4 years. And I want to say it's closer to like 40, it may be like 41%. So it's a low percentage that complete their bachelor's degree in 4 years. And again, that's across all first-time, full-time students in all races and ethnicities and socioeconomic levels. But yes, I think that ultimately students are being misinformed and need to prepare for what that may look like then if you are going to be in college for 6 to 10 years. And what that means, though, is that your ability to fully participate in the workforce is going to be hampered. So it's going to delay earnings. It's going to delay your ability if your future company has a matching retirement plan like a 401k or 403b, that's going to be delayed. Your ability to pursue the next degree that you may want to pursue or the next credential, that's going to be delayed. So, and then not to mention all of the other things like purchasing a home, all the other things that are part of, the American dream, if you will, all of those things are going to be delayed. So I do think that to some extent, that's why I get so concerned, because I want to, our goal should be to make sure we're providing students with as much information to be an informed consumer of higher education. And unfortunately, I think we're talking about college is important. You're going to need this in order to get a good job and make a particular type of living, but not sharing with them the pitfalls of not completing on time is important. And some of it is baked in, Dan. So, you have some institutions that have the required amount of credits to complete college in 4 years is over 130 credit hours, right? So at CCA, we really try to encourage at least taking 30 credit hours per year, which could be in summers, in the mini-mesters, fall, spring, whatever your terms are. But if a student is encouraged to take as many credits as they can so that they get as close to or they reach that 30 credit hour per year threshold, that way if there's a 120 credit hour requirement for graduation, they can complete on time, right? But if you have 136, 140 credit hours, even if you were to take that full load at the 30 credit hours per year threshold that we're recommending, you're not going to complete on time just based on the structure that you're entering as a student. So we also talk to institutions about, thinking about what's in their general ed requirements, how many of their credits are superfluous and don't really relate to or aren't germane to what a student needs to graduate and be considered a candidate for the baccalaureate degree. So thinking about how many credits they've actually baked into the system, and then whether or not those credits are actually impeding students' progress. But beyond that, making sure that there are supports on campus, because students are also people. Learners are people and they come from all different backgrounds. We're no longer in the time frame where everyone is 18 years old and fresh faced and they're just exploring themselves and figuring out life and they don't have any responsibilities. Many of the learners on campus now are parents. Many of them have jobs, sometimes multiple jobs, and they have a number of competing responsibilities. And so when you think about that, how college has to meet the student where they are is very different than they would have had to do, maybe 100 years ago. So thinking about, again, making this college more student ready and thinking about the types of students that they're serving is going to have to be the way that we move forward. We can no longer just say, ask faculty when they want to teach, and that's how we create the schedule. We have to think about when students need to learn and craft the schedule that way. So I think, there's so many ways to go back to answer your question. There's so many ways that if we keep the student in mind and focus on that primarily and inform them better about what it looks like in terms of keeping the student informed and what it's going to cost them if they don't complete college in the a certain time frame, I think it would give students more of an incentive. Because I think, I've heard this a lot where advisors actually tell students, take your time, just take a couple of courses and see what you think, right? So there's this sort of wait and see mentality, or like tiptoe through the tulips. And most of the, especially low income students or students who need to, make a living to provide for their families, they don't have time to meander through the curriculum. And so, giving that bad advice about taking 2 classes here or 1 class there is not really going to get them where they need to go. Now, if there's a way that there's a credential they're trying to earn and you're trying to help them to get a enough courses to meet that credential, which could have value in the workforce and help them get a better job, that's a different thing. But telling a student to take a few courses and tiptoe through the tulips is just bad advice. And I think we should be providing more upfront information to students to help them understand what the back end cost is going to be if they take that approach.
For my final topic, I'd like to talk to you about what it would look like if college funding were tied to completion rates. So what's going through my mind is that on the one end of the spectrum, you can envision a college that receives public funding and it has nothing to do with completion rates. So let's say, for example, that it's tied to enrollment. And so you get this sort of perverse incentive where at that point, the college has no incentive at all to have the student complete because that's the student who's going to leave. If you want to emphasize completion, I can envision something that's also not in the student's interest. So in the case where the college just wants enrollment, and so the student takes a long time to finish their college, that's obviously not in the student's interest. But at the other end of the spectrum, if a college just wants the student to finish because there's a financial incentive for completion where funding is tied to that completion, how do we ensure that the student is leaving with what they need? As a teacher, I also teach, and I sort of, I don't know, I picture this scenario in which a student has failed my course, but I have at the same time a college that has an incentive to have the student complete not only my course, but to have them complete their whole degree. How do you strike a balance if college funding is tied to completion rates?
Well, I appreciate that question, Dan. I mean, it's such a complicated proposition because, so it would be, I think we could say it's great. If you tie completion rates to funding, then that would serve as an incentive and it would make sure that we have more completion. And I would say not necessarily because, one, we have to take into account the mission of the institution. So there are some two-year colleges, for example, who, based on the type of institution, its proximate nature to students, they are more likely to go there and take a couple of classes or to skill up or do that sort of thing. They're not necessarily looking for a degree. And because of that trend, that institution would be negatively impacted by funding tied to completion rate. So that's one example. Another example are, minority serving institutions, which tend to have more students who are Pell eligible, more students who are first generation, more students who come from, racially minoritized backgrounds. They're going to be in a situation where they're dealing with a lot of competing issues. The school has to have more resources to actually deal with the backgrounds that I just explained. So when you're talking about if their students have not historically completed, they're not going to get the funding. They're going to need more funding to help them complete and to provide the wraparound supports. And so you're going to end up with a sort of the unintended consequences of the policy, I think, could have negative impacts on the institutions and ultimately the students. So I think that, yes, in an ideal world, that we'd have to craft it in a way that would also have some proxies for institutional type, the students that are being served, all those other things, so that institutions are not being penalized by serving the most hard to serve students. And I say that with respect to the students, not out of disrespect, but when I say hard to serve, I'm saying with limited resources, trying to serve students who have a number of needs like housing insecurity, food insecurity, et cetera, et cetera. You're trying to meet those needs while you're also meeting their academic, social, emotional, financial, co-curricular, all those other needs. It's going to be more difficult. So in an ideal world, it'd be great, but I think there's so many complexities that underlie the proposition that it's just hard to do that in a straightforward way.
Dr. Yolanda Watson Spiva, thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Dan, for having me.
Thanks for joining me. Please feel free to email me with questions, comments, or suggestions for content that you'd like to hear about. You can reach me at mortarboardpodcast@gmail.com. Consider stopping by my blog, mortarboardblog.com. The blog contains links to stories that I think will interest you, podcast transcripts, and articles I've written. You can also like me on Facebook at Dr. Daniel Barwick or follow me on Twitter at Daniel Barwick. Looking forward to talking with you in the next episode.